we are talking about the compendium of our 60 years of business together, rather.
Well, Transfield family, all the chapters, most of which have been recorded with the various interviews we've done with all of the people who've been part of our journey. Some very interesting discussions, very interesting stories. I'm thinking about some of the people who've been with us the longest, people like Tony Shepherd, David Ibrack. So they're all now being recorded. And I think, Luca, you and I were just talking a few minutes ago about really what defines our era. And I think our era was defined by when Marco was stepped down as managing director, or actually our dad
Correct.
took him out of that role and put me into the role, and that was in '99. So that's really the beginning of this next chapter for us, our chapter together.
And so just reflecting on what happened prior to that, here was Marco, who was not happy with the way the business was going. He took a particular view about one project especially. Maybe he had a sense that he wanted to be independent, who knows, but so it went through that family feud, which was well publicised at the time, and fortunately we came to a resolution to enable us to go forward, and which meant the listing of Transfield Services.
Yeah, well, that was a consequence, of course, of that whole chapter, and Marco was certainly not at all interested in construction, and effectively put us in a very inenviable position to actually get rid of it, and we spent a lot of time trying to find ways around that joint venture, the company. In fact, you might remember I made a few trips to Europe and spoke to the French and the Italians who might have come. It could have been a very different history, in fact, if some of those joint ventures were to have come off, as opposed to us eventually selling to the Leighton Group, and it went into the John Holland part. And it was good, actually, that in that regard, we actually had the thousands of people we had in the company actually go to a new home, and were well looked after by, John Hollands. And so from my point of view, I felt, that it was not the best option for the company, but at least we knew that there was an ongoing future for the people who'd been so loyal to the company for so long. Yeah.
Well, I think we did take the view as well that construction was not something that we really wanted to be in on our own, and we felt that it was too demanding of a balance sheet, and too demanding of, or the risk was what it was, and so we were prepared to joint venture it, but we weren't able to find someone who was prepared to do that, and or at least on the terms that we were interested in, so we ended up going through a sale process. So that's fine. So good. So that actually freed us up in a way to do whatever we wanted to do from 2003 onwards, and we spent some time looking at various opportunities. It was like 2 years of kicking tires between. We looked at property development. We looked at property development independently of a listed vehicle or an unlisted vehicle, and we ended up then taking a first position, I think, in Charter Hall. That was kind of our first major foray into an investment post Transfield Construction.
Yeah, and post-listing Transfield Services, which was a very important milestone, because we had still some very good assets in the Transfield Holdings Group, and we felt that putting our infrastructure assets together with the maintenance business really did add something interesting, and it did. And we think about it. There's a whole chapter there we've recorded, and that we can, I think, reflect on the that placement in the stock exchange has been overall a great success story. Not as financially rewarding as we would have liked it to have been, but at least the company grew and developed, and it's just as we talk, just changed its name to Broad Spectrum. So there's a whole chapter there.
In fact, you remember, just recently we were trying to sort of do an assessment of what our financial outcomes have been post the split
with the
Salteris. So back in now 96, so it's 20 years
next year,
and each of the companies were worth around 320 to 350 million, the Tenix and the Transfield, and I think you could, we're on balance, we kind of we haven't lost out. We maybe haven't done as well as the Tenix, the Salteri family, but we're still here and we're still doing business.
That's the main thing. And we've had some wonderful journeys on the way through, as you started to mention, our chapter with Charter Hall. That was really, we helped transform a small company of, 40 or 50 people. Both to give it leverage to actually build scale and also put it on the stock exchange, and that's been a very successful company. So, we've done a good job there. We then followed up with our activities in campus living villages with a nice idea of doing university accommodation on their site, quite an interesting model, with the Tuscan guys, the two Davids, and they had one project, if you remember, 300. We actually technically owned about 320 rooms, when you broke it down from an asset point of view, and we just sold out of it last year when it was trading with 45,000 beds. So here's another great growth story that we can take some credit for.
Yeah, good experience. Yeah, it was all good. So then we did that, and the other major foray was Novatec, and that was really exciting in the sense it was started as an Australian play.
As solar heat and power.
Yeah. And then we chased that technology, or we chased an entry point somewhere in that in that renewable energy space, in that solar energy space, and we ended up finding a similar technology which we regarded was better in Germany, with Antoine, who was resident in Switzerland at the time.
That's right.
Yeah. So it was quite an exciting thing, and it had a lot of promise. There's no question. I mean, I think there was a whole lot of optimism in that whole space, in that whole concentrating solar power space, and we felt that we had the low cost solution,
which didn't prove to be the case in the end, because the solar panels really took over with particularly Chinese. I remember when we moved into that technology in that space in 2007. Our cost base was lower than solar panel, and we thought we would go down a natural cost curve, in reducing our cost, which we would have got to if we had the volume. But the solar panels just immediately in the next few years just absolutely creamed the world.
And we were the only ones that didn't see that happening. I mean, the whole concentrating solar power industry didn't see it. In fact, so even though we might have been the low cost option in CSP, it wasn't good enough to win the day in terms of the whole solar energy space.
Yeah, correct.
So, Charter Hall. Well, Transworld Services, we stayed on as board members up until 2012, so only up until 3 years ago, and we had an investment up until a year or two ago, and it's been a challenging business. I mean, when you consider that now, when we exited, was basically we exited at the same price as a listing price. And so a whole lot of experiences, because that big play that we did originally apart from growing the business amazingly, that getting that low-hanging fruit in that whole outsourced space in Australia in 2007, I think it was, or 6, I think we bought into USM in the US. So that was like our big overseas expansion play. We thought, here we are. It was Dean Wills who was kind of saying, the next horizon is international, so here we go. And then we learned, of course, that it wasn't that easy. In fact, that business proved to be not as good as we thought it was, and so we learned some lessons.
Yeah, however you say that, but then when we went to Canada, we actually did extremely well for a number of years, if you remember. True. So, I don't think we can just say that overseas activities is necessarily a negative thing. I think we were probably, I think the model of our takeover and our acquisition of USM was probably flawed, because we had effectively an earn-out, and these people had got most of their money up front. And so even if they never earned their earn-out, they were still going to be very wealthy as a result of what they'd achieved. So I think these are one of the difficulties. You've got to be careful about choosing businesses where you have somebody with a very good model, and that person or that team has driven it, and then those members of those teams can disperse or leave your company. Then, it becomes a different dynamic.
Correct.
So certainly that's
Correct.
one of the learnings that I've taken away from business, just to be very careful about jumping on board with people who've really come up with something very interesting and think you can replicate it and grow it yourself. Because they're in a bigger organisation, you add complexity by definition.
Yeah.
When you move something into a
That's right.
smaller thing into it.
And then you risk taking away their initiative, which is kind of what was at the heart of the business growth, their business growth to start with.
Yeah.
So just reflecting then, what else through this period Novatech. We then went through, we may as well talk about how we exited these various businesses, because the Campus Living Villages business, we were we had this sort of, where are we going to be in, or are we going to be out? We were kind of happy to be in, but I think at the end of the day, our co-investors wanted to insource the manager.
Which we had, which we
owned, and they weren't. Well, they were kind of They were kind of pretty much convinced that they wanted to go down that way, and so we were interested in staying in just as a passive investor. I think at the end of the day, that was kind of the dynamic. So we sold out,
and I think we picked a good time to sell out, because I think this whole student accommodation market is now becoming much more. It's a more interesting one. It's a bigger one.
Yeah.
But there are a lot more players in it. So, I think we probably found a good time to exit the business, and we made a huge contribution. As I said, from 320 beds to 45,000. Now, not all of the capital in the end was ours, but the model and the manager was ours, and we certainly I'm very proud of what we did in Campus.
Yeah, and even there, so once again there too, there was this interesting international play. The US again was a big part of the business, so both through Transform Services and Campus Living, we got quite a bit of exposure to US business across the various jurisdictions in the various states. So that was amazing. So good. And then Novatech, of course, was the European exercise with Germany. So and you spent so much time going backwards and forwards there. Yeah. So we got such an interesting exposure between the continent and the US in terms of business experiences.
And plus we were doing our projects in Spain, and we had our test for Novatech. We had our test base in Spain, and just travelling through Europe as a result of that, and all the other people that we were meeting as a result of trying to find co-investors or other customers and whatever, made that, as you say, look, a very interesting chapter to actually be exposed to international activities, firsthand. Not reading through the paper, actually being in those countries and experiencing.
Actually, we didn't even talk about the ADI, because we were saying, that we're thinking about our international experiences with Thales, of course, a joint venture there, going to France, on occasions for the joint venture meetings, or rather, the board meetings. And then there was also Transdev, there was the
activities through Transfer Services with the transportation experts,
that's
French
right.
company.
Before the listing and even post the listing, that's right. So there's kind of all of those interesting international players that gave us lots of perspective, and once again that real learning that you do working with other companies, well, in this case internationals, which we had part of our DNA with Transfield, with the various joint ventures, as we've talked about in the past. So it's an amazingly fortunate business exposure that we've had.
Yeah, I think that, as a result of what our father created and what he achieved with Carlos Altieri, that 40-year relationship built an extraordinary group of businesses which we were fortunate to be involved in. And we were talking before about the fact that, I don't know about when you started, but I started my holidays when I was still at school, going into the office repairing
So-
the marquetry with my good friend Steve O'Brien,
Yeah.
who worked with us at Transfield and went to John Holland's, by the way,
That's
which is
right.
now owned by the Chinese, and so he's still there, just as
There
a
you go.
curiosity. So we started young, and the company gave us a platform for experiencing various different levels of business. Your expertise in architecture and property development, and then of course management, businesses thereafter was
Yeah.
very instructive.
Yeah.
Very
It's all
informative.
good. And of course, we managed to galvanise. It was kind of the great strength of the history of the organisation, to galvanise all these individuals and teams and do great things. Lots of people sacrificed a lot of their family spare time to make a lot of what we achieved happen. And so I'm conscious that we had such a great exposure to all of these people, and
But more than that, we created the platform for some people who had the courage to actually go off and do their own thing. We just met Carmelo Bontempo, who worked with us in Port Hedland in the 60s, who then went off and founded UGL and had a major contribution to Monadelphous, who was just singing the praises of the discipline and the respect that he had for our father. And there were many people that we know that went off and set up their own businesses as a result of what Transfield did. And in many ways what Dad and Salteri did was exactly the same from EPT.
That's right.
Which was
and many people that stayed with us for such a long time and made such great contributions and there are projects to, in a sense, people can proudly speak to those achievements, those projects. In the past.
They're all milestone projects. You just go through them. The Sydney Harbour Tunnel, the Melbourne City Link, the railway, the railway out to the airport.
One in Brisbane.
The Brisbane one in Brisbane. The major projects we built in industrial places in Port Hedland, Gove. Think all the stuff that we did in resources and mining and power stations. We built.
Yeah.
We were involved in virtually every main
That's right.
power station in the country.
That's right. We mustn't. It makes me reminds me of Marco, in the sense that because Marco, he was the one that you could credit for driving that acquisition of ICAL and ADI and ASI and EGLO, and bringing them all together for the purposes of that Amacon frigate contract. And so that brought into the group all of those companies with
and
all of those capabilities, the David Bakers, Hans Offs, etc., Brian Eslick, Glenn Cunningham. So many people that, you start talking about names, of course, and then you risk excluding others, but there were so many other people that came into that Transfield group and gave us such a broad expertise. At one point we were turning over $1.5 billion with 5,000 plus employees, and we were the biggest engineering contracting group in Australia. So that was at our peak, if you like, in
probably in the 90s,
early 90s. That's right. Yeah.
So you got to then push that number up to actually reflect it in 2015 dollars, which would mean a much bigger turnover.
Yeah.
But you're right, Luca, and it was a very large industrial company, and since we lost that platform through, in reality, a few projects that weren't managed well. I think my own view is that the disturbance that came and the dislocation that came as a result of the separation from Salterius, which Marco drove, and then his decision not to work with you and I, brought a period of about 5 years or more of disruption and lack of focus on the operational activities of the company. And from my own point of view, and looking back in time, and I was too young really and less experienced to actually recognise at the time the consequences of that and what would have been the right solutions. Now looking back with the benefit of hindsight, I think they were the things that led to a number of projects going bad because we weren't watching them closely like we were all the way through up to the early 90s. That's my own take on it. I don't think I've ever shared it with you in those words, but that then really put the company in a position where the balance sheet was significantly reduced and didn't have the capacity and firepower that it could have had, that it had earlier and could have had going forward.
Yeah.
And so we had to take those choices. But I think the choices we took under the circumstances were very smart choices because we preserved capital for another chapter, which I'm very proud about, notwithstanding the changes. And you have to work with whatever the palette is that you have at the time, and that was the palette we had then. That was a very disruptive period and emotionally draining. I think about the time that you spent fighting the legal case against Marco from effectively the late 90s all the way through to 2003 until we got the final solution. They were really difficult periods.
It's difficult to know. I mean, Marco had his was sort of quite dogged in terms of his intention to separate from us. Okay, now fast forward to where we are today. We are now looking at managing Transfield as a virtual joint venture. So we've decided to have a go at doing our own things independently of Transfield. At the same time, we can do Transfield. So Transfield is no that legacy of a major infrastructure developer is kind of there's a line in the sand now.
That chapter is over.
Yeah, that chapter is over. So we've got virtually no more personnel within Transfield. We are taking some personnel into our own particular family offices, and we are looking to do our own thing, but also find those opportunities where we can come together. And I think I described it in terms of sort of taking advantage of the enterprise of others now as a financial investor to start with, and then see whether that might transform into something more or otherwise. But that is the how I would like to define our new future.
I think you're absolutely right. The only colour I'd add to it is that we don't know where either our joint investment, if we decide to do it through Transfield Holdings, or our separate investments through our own family offices, to our two family office companies, will take us, because that could actually go down a path where we become more active again. I'm loath to try to predict where they can go, because who would have predicted in '99 what we've done over the next 15 years?
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Luckily, we've got enough capital left over for both of us to do that after we've had a series of liquidity events. We got out of a number of legacy projects and businesses, Novatech, Transfield Services, Campus Living Villages, and
Perisher.
And these were our mainstay, if you like.
Yeah.
And we still have a hold on the Sydney Harbour Tunnel as a partnership with the Saltieri family and Kumagai. So, I think, we're in a very interesting position now, and particularly with the markets being quite volatile and not quite knowing where they're going to go. This means that, if we're judicious in the way we direct our funds and our energies, we could still make a good contribution going forward. And we will anyway, even if we're a passive investor, because the use of capital for any enterprise or any business is always helping turnover activity. But if we actually are hands-on or more closely associated with it, it could be an interesting time.
Yeah, and that's all good. Just makes me think about we didn't mention our philanthropic aspects. So because we've talked about, we didn't talk about whether it's the Biennale, Sculpture by the Sea, the ACO, and then we had that episode with Transfield Services where we tried to do things together as a Transfield Foundation. Then it sort of came apart with the various sort of kerfuffle vicissitudes around the detention centres that Transfield Services is involved in. But so we have a legacy of philanthropy, which we've been known for, particularly within the arts, and we're still exploring what we might do with that going forward.
Yeah, that's true. But I think the important part is actually reflect on the fact that, we were brought up in an environment where arts and support of the arts was a very big part of initially our father through the Biennale and the Transworld Art Prize prior to that, and our mother, who was a great art historian. She had a tremendous interest in Renaissance art, as we all know, and that gave us an exposure to that type of interest. But ultimately, the physical participation in the various arts activities. In our case, both of us spent some time with the Biennale the last 15 years after Dad, founded it. On my own time at the ACO, what we've done jointly with Sculpture by the Sea, I feel very proud about those things. And the family to the Art Gallery of New South Wales is another great chapter,
right.
So, we've shown the way in that area in arts philanthropy, and I imagine continue to do so. I mean, you've got your own New Democracy, which is not an arts space, but the confidence I imagine the confidence that you've had through art philanthropy has given you the confidence to actually take up a more social enterprise, if you like.
And that whole civic space, I think we both recognise that there's we have the capacity because of financial, whatever, social status to make some contribution, but it's kind of, and it's all on the strength of this great organisation that has managed to carve such a profile for itself, and really it'll be interesting to see how we can sort of keep that profile alive in some respect, even though we're going to be doing our own things independently.
Yeah. Well, I feel pretty confident that we'll be able to do that. I think our own reputation, the family's reputation, as long as we don't do anything stupid, I think we'll continue to make a contribution. It's certainly my intention, because I'm interested in life, the arts, people, helping society, all these projects that we all get involved in. Ultimately, it's actually the better, the platform for the societies that we participate in. And we happen to be, as you say, very fortunate with what we've had carved out for us, if you like, and we've taken on the next chapter, the next step.
Yeah, it's great. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well.